Myanmar is now the largest producer of opium in the world.
Is this crisis a structural failure of a state?
They are defrauding Americans of tens of billions of dollars per year.
And we were very much focusing on multilateralism, bilateralism.
First is the issue of scam centers.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Power Play with Shahab Anam Khan, hosted by Alap. Today we are going to discuss about something very, very important, not only for Bangladesh, but also for two regions, Southeast Asia and South Asia. It is about Myanmar. And why are we going to discuss about Myanmar? The very important reason is now we have an astronomical number of stateless population in making. Almost 1.1 million population are sitting in Cox's Bazar without a very definite future. And this is one of the group which has been suffering not only over the past 1 decade, but it's a suffering that has been there for many decades by now. It has become a geopolitical issue. It has become a national security concern. It is a humanitarian issue. And most importantly, this is an issue that will determine the level of humanity, dignity, and safety of the populations living in South and Southeast Asia. Now, this staggering number also comes with a very ominous number too, a number of young newborn children, children without parents, and that also adds to the uncertainty of a group of people who are virtually stateless. And now we are seeing that Bangladesh has a new border counterpart in first time in its history, which is not run by a state actor, but a non-state actor. So therefore, from Bangladesh's perspective, other side of the border with Myanmar is controlled by the Arakan Army. At the same time, we are now seeing that this sort of instability become a major conversation in the diplomatic theaters, political theaters, and now we have a new government in Bangladesh who will also have to look into this issue from a very, very fresh perspective. And today, to discuss these critical issues, I have a guest who has witnessed making and unmaking of politics, ethnicity, communalism, and perhaps stability or development, whichever perspective we talk about. In Myanmar's villages, he has been a regular visitor to refugee camps in Cox's Bazar, and Cox's Bazar hosts the largest refugee camp in the world, Kutupalong camp particularly. He has worked with very important think tanks, the Richardson Center. He has worked with the Carter Center. He has been an active actor within the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. And now he's a senior fellow at the Stimson Center. And Stimson Center is highly regarded, highly appreciated think tank that has considerable influence within the Washington policy circle. My guest has appeared before the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, in which he has talked about the current situation in Myanmar, and that talk was labeled as no exit strategy, perhaps. And he has been one of the cardinal feature in shaping U.S. conversation or U.S. rhetoric on the Myanmar issues. He currently leads the Crisis in Myanmar's Rakhine State Project at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. And Steve is well known in global political circle that takes interest in Myanmar, that takes interest in refugee issues, and he has been a regular contributor to Bangladesh's political and strategic narratives, and most importantly, the human narratives regarding refugee. With that note, let us welcome Mr. Steve Ross.
Thank you, Shahab.
Welcome to my show.
Thank you, Shahab. It's great to be here.
And it's always lovely to see you because you bring the fresh perspective. You bring the perspective from the grassroots. And of course, you bring perspectives from the power circles that evolves around this particular crisis. Now, you see that these particular crises has metastasized from a humanitarian emergency into a full geopolitical contest too. China has its infrastructure interest. India has its connectivity interests. Thailand has to maintain a huge border, making it much more less capable to really provide a very concrete solutions all the time. And then US is largely absent too. I'm talking from Dhaka's point of view. I mean, of course, the Burma Act is very much there, and you are extremely well conversant about the Burma Act. And Bangladesh is in the process holding almost 1.5 million stateless people, as I mentioned earlier. That also comes with a collapsing aid. USAID is largely gone. Joint plan that the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees office has dwindled to 37%. I mean, they pledged for more than $900 million. Not even 37% has come. Food ration has really gone to a very meager level. And then you are also seeing that Bangladesh's diplomatic efforts have been varied, but essentially it was very much there. And we were very much focusing on multilateralism, bilateralism. Now, with all these problems that we get to see, I mean, our biggest concern is that is the international community forgetting this problem and putting it on the shoulder of Bangladesh? Are the windows gone? And perhaps one thing I would like to know from you before you answer all these questions, because you were at the School of Advanced and International Studies at Johns Hopkins where you gave a talk, and where it was framed as the Myanmar conflict South Asia's strategic stakes. We have always seen it from Southeast Asia's stake, and now that the framing is South Asia's stake, and quite interesting. Now, given all these things, my first question to you, is this crisis a structural failure of a state never built to hold together? Or has it become a geopolitical contest between China or the United States or the Eastern Bloc versus the Western Bloc? Or perhaps why this distinction between Southeast Asia and South Asia matter for how we solve it?
Thank you.
I know it's a complicated question, but you're the most capable person to answer.
Well, maybe I'll start just by reiterating why I think this is an issue that should matter to the U.S. and to policymakers in Washington, D.C. First is the issue of scam centers. Myanmar has been a huge hub for scam centers over the last several years, particularly since COVID and the coup in 2021. And there are tens of thousands of people that are involved in the industry in Myanmar, and they are defrauding Americans of tens of billions of dollars per year. So there's a significant interest, or there should be a significant interest, and we have seen some policy movement and some action from the administration on this issue. That's going to continue to be an issue in the coming months and years. Second is drugs. Myanmar has become the largest producer of opium in the world. That's come in part on the backs of a collapse in production in Afghanistan. But Myanmar is now the largest producer of opium in the world. And in addition to that, is a major producer of synthetic drugs. And third, and perhaps most importantly, is the broader question of regional stability. Myanmar, I would say, poses a threat to regional stability with the internal conflict spilling over its borders in terms of refugees, in terms of the potential for diseases to migrate across borders. Myanmar has been a hub of drug-resistant malaria and other diseases. And those are things that aren't going to be contained within Myanmar. So for all of those reasons and others, which I won't go into now, I think it's an issue that the U.S. should care about more than it does. But as we've seen, particularly over the last month, but also over the past 20 years, the U.S. has really struggled to maintain a consistent focus on the Indo-Pacific. To your question, though, I don't know that I would say that Myanmar has become a geopolitical contest, because at this point it isn't really a contest.
Sure.
China is far and away the most influential actor in Myanmar, and there is not any other stakeholder that can come close to matching the leverage and influence that China has. And that influence has only grown over the last year and a half, when it became much more heavily involved in Myanmar, beginning in late 2024. To be sure, on the structural weaknesses part of your question, I think that is an element that is there, and China has sought to take advantage of that by playing one side off of the other. One side being the government or the regime in Naypyidaw, the other side being a range of different resistance actors and ethnic armed groups, and calibrating its support to those different actors over time to advance its own interests. So you have this back and forth calibration, which has enabled China to advance its interests and also created a degree of instability that it is comfortable with, but which other actors are not as comfortable engaging with.
Yeah, does it mean kind of a very imperial British idea of carrot and stick?
Sorry?
Carrot and stick? Kind of like carrot and stick policy, isn't it? I mean...
Yes, there is, I would say, a very calibrated policy of support from the Chinese side, and the best example of that, I think, is the major offensive operation, Operation 1027, which was named after the date on which it was launched, October 27th in 2023, where you had a coalition of ethnic armed groups and other resistance actors in Myanmar launching a major offensive with tacit Chinese support to ostensibly address the issue of scam centers on the China-Myanmar border. But when this offensive pushed beyond the boundaries of what China was comfortable with, it swung its support much more heavily behind the Myanmar military, beginning in August of 2024. And you see this calibration continuing right now. It is still very heavily behind the regime in Naypyidaw and the application of significant pressure on the ethnic armed groups, particularly on the China-Myanmar border.
Because this is very important, Steve, and when you talked about scam center, drugs, and we're now seeing that the scam centers have become a major headache for everyone. I mean, not only the U.S., perhaps even I was in Cambodia. I mean, they're very worried about it. The Thais are extremely worried about it. And perhaps this brings all these countries to really cooperate with each other to really look into this scam center, the wildlife and whatnot. I mean, everything that you talk about. I mean, even Bangladesh's drugs, narcotics is essentially coming from Myanmar side. I mean, well, all these things are very important. I mean, obviously creating kind of a security loopholes for everyone. And that brings me to one important argument that many of the Stevenson or, Washington analyses, I found that the Washington's Myanmar policy rests on two misapprehensions. May I use the term misapprehensions over here? By denoting that the greater U.S. engagement risks a proxy war with China. That's one kind of narrative we get to hear. And that ASEAN-led diplomacy will eventually the best option to either counter China or perhaps the best solutions for Myanmar to become much more integrated with the ASEAN values of stability and so on. Now, I assume you might always think that these are wrong ideas that is influencing the U.S. decision making. And perhaps at the same time, Donald Trump has cut USAID and ended the temporary protection for those Burmese who were living in the United States under different kind of asylum or protections. So that is also gone. Now, what does these particular absence or perhaps understanding that, greater U.S. engagement will essentially bring much more instability, or perhaps ASEAN is the best solution, which we haven't seen as yet. And what does this American absence actually cost? be it in human terms, be it in strategic terms, or perhaps even in terms of China's footprint, which I get to hear quite often in Washington policy circle, that the Chinese footprint is an issue for them. And then, of course, the Indo-Pacific comes in, the bigger Indo-Pacific. So how do you see that? I mean, this absence, I mean, it is widely felt.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll start with the proxy war part of the question first. I think the Burma Act, which you referenced earlier, which was passed as a part of the NDAA in 2022, I believe, it set out a strategy and policy for the U.S. vis-a-vis Myanmar. And I think what happened is you saw the Biden administration being reluctant to fully implement the act as it was designed, and ended up in some ways with, I think, the worst of both worlds, in that you had this signaling that the U.S. was going to be much more involved, but without backing it up with the resources and support that was intended. And so the way that signal was received in China is to get the impression that the U.S. was arming and equipping ethnic armed groups against the Myanmar military and the regime in Naypyidaw. And I think that was a major reason, not the only reason. Another key reason being the success of Operation 1027 beyond Chinese expectations. But the Burma Act also played a role in China shifting its support from some of the ethnic armed groups on the China-Myanmar border to the regime in Naypyidaw. And so I think it demonstrates the risk that exists of the U.S. signaling its intentions to be more heavily involved in a place like Myanmar when it does not fully commit to that involvement, because it gives China the impression that the U.S. is going to be much more heavily involved, right, and they adjust and recalibrate accordingly. So I think there is a danger there. With respect to ASEAN, I think that ASEAN leaders would acknowledge that the 5-point consensus, which was agreed in April of 2021, just a few months after the coup, approaching the 5-year anniversary of that, that it has not met expectations, that it provided a foundation and a framework for engagement across the bloc on Myanmar, but it has not delivered results. And I think ASEAN is still grappling with how it can and should approach Myanmar, and there is, I would say, more divisions within the bloc now than over the last couple of years, with differences between mainland and maritime Southeast Asia over how to approach the issue. And with the pullback of the U.S., I think it removes a significant potential counterweight to Chinese influence in Myanmar and in the region more broadly. I think I've outlined why that's important because of regional stability and scam centers and drugs. There are also, I think, normative reasons to care and be concerned about Myanmar that are linked to some of the regional stability issues. But it's hard to get that calibration right. And I think that that's something that the U.S. is going to continue to grapple with as it seeks to articulate a new Myanmar policy, with a policy review having been underway since the new administration came to power last year.
No, this is very interesting. I mean, when you talk about calibration, I think calibration or recalibration, one thing that really influences Dhaka's decision-making is who has the leverage, and leverage on whom. One issue is that we talked about this China's checkbook, pipelines, investment, everything is there. The Indians have very strong investment interest. I mean, particularly if you look at the way they're trying to build and make connectivity operational, which is known as the Kaladan project. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, you have the Thais. I mean, their biggest headache is, of course, the cross-border movement through a very, very porous border. And then Arakan Army is talking to everyone. I mean, if you look at Beijing, they're speaking to Beijing, they're talking to Delhi. They are trying to talk to Bangkok quite often, and I'm quite sure they are trying to reach out to different important actors, whether within the region or beyond the region. Now, even sometimes Thailand was being talked about as a safe zone provider or a facilitator. So that kind of. Now, here is the question then. I mean, if you are seeing that the Americans are pulling back, and perhaps even if I speak to Chinese scholars or think tankers, I mean, if you speak to them, that scam center drugs, these are also their main concern too. I mean, it's not like that the scam centers are not affecting the Chinese narratives. It is heavily affecting Chinese. And we have seen that a number of people who were apprehended by the Chinese government being involved in the scam centers too. Now, all of them have different kind of stakes, as you have rightly mentioned. Now, here is my question. Who among these stakes or who among these actors holds the most decisive influence over what actually happens in Rakhine? Or perhaps, is there any version of solution to the Rohingya crisis that does not require either China or United States or perhaps ASEAN to actively enable it? And perhaps this is very much linked with one important issue that you talk about a lot, is the elections. I mean, will the elections in Myanmar make any of these actors much more powerful or less powerful?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think China has by far the most influence of any external stakeholder in Myanmar as a whole, and I think that extends to Rakhine as well. But I think that its influence is often overstated. It does not have as much influence in Rakhine as it does on the ethnic groups on the China-Myanmar border because of that physical distance. At the same time, I think that the Arakan Army knows what China's red lines are and is reticent to step over those red lines. But I think it's also worth considering the ways in which China might actually be a barrier to a resolution to the crisis. It has, I think, quite clearly over the last 8+ years signaled its intention to protect the regime in Naypyidaw, or prior to the coup, the NLD government in Naypyidaw. That extends to a desire not to see the conflict internationalized and not to see it internationalized. A emphasis on mediation by the Chinese between Myanmar and Bangladesh, but without other external stakeholders, and a resistance to measures that might be helpful and supportive to the resolution of the conflict or the amelioration of the conflict, but which could be seen as stepping on Myanmar's sovereignty. So I think that China has influence, but there are limits to it, and it's not clear that China necessarily wants to see a resolution to the crisis in the way that Bangladesh might. When you talk to Rohingya, it's interesting to get their perspective on this. I, a couple of years ago, ran a series of workshops in the refugee camps, and when you initially discussed, who do you think has the most influence over your futures and resolving this conflict? The immediate response is the international community, the UN, the EU, the US, and that's sort of the reflexive response. But when you start to break down what that actually looks like in practice, I think it becomes a much more granular appreciation of who actually holds power in determining what happens on a day-to-day basis. Correct. And the responses then shift from powerful international actors to local actors, whether it be the Arakan Army, Rohingya armed groups, Bangladesh, and that's maybe putting Bangladesh as a unitary actor when it probably has different views and perspectives between civilian and security actors and others, and the Rohingya themselves, Rohingya civil society actors, and the Myanmar military, to a lesser extent now than a few years ago, but obviously the Myanmar military still has some leverage and influence, largely I would say as a spoiler, right. But is still a key stakeholder vis-a-vis the crisis as a whole, and in comparison to the quote-unquote international community.
No, I think this is interesting, Steve. I mean, when you speak to the Rohingya community, they do have very strong, I would use the term faith on international community, because, I mean, they have largely seen that the international community has been the key enabler of their livelihoods. So they're equally grateful to Bangladesh for helping the Rohingyas to remain as they are. But at the same time, the issue of Arakan Army comes in. You have mentioned that, well, Rohingya civil society is an issue, how Rohingyas are factored in Myanmar as a collective voice is an issue too. But that means that when I see Arakan Army, I mean, as one of the key actors in Rakhine, sometimes I get to hear, I mean, in Dhaka or London or Washington in many cases, either from a very partnership point of view, or some would say obstacle, some would say both, or even the International Crisis Group documented in June 2025, that there are a lot of concerns about internal displacement too. And in fact, Amnesty International documented forced labor under Arakan Army being there. The Amnesty has also talked about movement restrictions and conditions, and some of the researchers actually said that, well, I mean, AA has literally replaced junta as the oppressor. Now, these are the views that you get to hear. And yet most analyses, including yourself, I mean, you would always argue, and perhaps I would also argue in that same manner, that any repatriation pathway runs through the Arakan Army, and perhaps less to do with junta sometimes. But again, the state would always tell you that, no, I can't bypass Myanmar as an unitary state, so therefore Myanmar is the legal entity that we have to engage with. Now, how do we square that circle?
Sure. It's a difficult question, because there have been, since the AA took over the vast majority of Rakhine over the course of 2024, there have been allegations of abuses by them against the Rohingya, particularly during the prosecution of the conflict against the Myanmar military, and to excise them from parts of Rakhine, but obviously continuing beyond that as well. I think my analysis is based on a couple of assumptions. One is that the Arakan Army's durability, its staying power in Rakhine, especially in northern Rakhine, is going to be a factor that we have to reckon with. I do not believe, as some others do, that the Myanmar military is going to come back in full force in Rakhine, and again, particularly northern Rakhine, in the way that it has been able to launch meaningful counteroffensives in northern Shan State and in other parts of Myanmar. I don't think those examples map well onto the dynamics in Rakhine. So that's one factor that...
Before you go to the second one, why do you think that? I mean, if I am seeing it from a very war tactical point of view, or perhaps counteroffensive, and so, I mean, just to have a conversation on this, I mean, I would always counter-argue by saying, well, everything depends on how these three forces within Myanmar comes together and go for counteroffensive jointly.
Sure. I would say that the Myanmar military strategy, and this has been supported by the Chinese over the last year and a half, has been to pick off different ethnic actors one at a time, and that includes Bamar PDFs as well. But you saw them start with the MNDAA. That was the first group to agree to a ceasefire in January of last year. The TNLA followed suit. We've seen military counteroffensives in Mandalay be successful, as well as in Karenni in the southeast. So there has been this pattern of a shift in momentum over the last year and a half. And in theory, you could see a redeployment of military forces from other parts of the country to Rakhine. There have been regular movements of troops from other parts of the country to Rakhine in modest numbers. And that's both in Rakhine itself and to the east of the Rakhine-Yoma Mountains, where the Arakan Army has pushed into Magwe and Sagaing and Bago over the Magwe, Bago, and Irrawaddy over the last year or so. I think where I am a bit skeptical is one, how entrenched the Arakan Army has become. Two, the geographical advantages that the AA has of having this mountain range separate most of the state from the rest of the country. Three, the popular support the AA has among the Rakhine population, which was not matched in the same way in some of the areas in northern Shan, where the MNDA and TNLA had pushed into territories where they were controlling populations that were of different ethnicities. And over the last year and a half, despite significant airstrikes, significant efforts to push back against the AA, particularly on some of the more peripheral areas, but including in Chaopiu, they have not been able to make significant gains. And I think particularly in northern Rakhine, where the Myanmar military essentially has no presence at all anymore, the ability to mount a serious counteroffensive, I think it would be a very tall order for them to be able to go into that very difficult terrain and retake territory and hold it among a hostile population.
I mean, this is very interesting. I mean, when you talk about the hostile population, I mean, that gives an added advantage, of course, in its war tactics or the strategic engagement. And perhaps they are now, as we read, almost like 80% territories under their control. And I think this is a very important point to understand the difference between the southern Rakhine and the northern Rakhine. And northern Rakhine is where Bangladesh's strategic interest lies. And this is why this is a very important question. As you have rightly mentioned, the durability. So durability comes with the sustainability too. I mean, yes, I mean, as an armed group, you do have the added advantage. But again, if you see it from a very political point of view, well, are they actually delivering is the question. Because you see, when you have this greater responsibility of controlling territory, that means you also have to understand that you don't have the international recognition as such, which is, again, an important factor. And Bangladesh is probably one of the countries that can potentially help them to have international recognition to a great extent. Then you're talking about, you have the restive border with Bangladesh, which is, again, as I earlier mentioned, that, for us it is not non-state actor. And then, of course, you have the Rohingyas increasingly becoming restless, for obvious reason, that there is no meaningful things happening. And there has been more than 150,000 Rohingyas, as UN documented, have actually come to Bangladesh. I mean, these are the things which really makes the understanding of the Arakan Army complicated. I mean, we cannot see them from a binary prism of saying good or bad, but perhaps these are the, puzzles that we have to really solve. Now, here is the question that when we don't have the question, we don't have the international recognition for Arakan Army, and perhaps they need trade, they need investment, they need everything. But then the accountability issue comes in. So who's going to hold Arakan Army accountable despite having a popular mandate? I mean, popular mandate doesn't mean that you won't become an authoritarian. We have seen in our history, right? So therefore, the question is, who is going to hold them accountable? Are they going to really, morph themselves into an accountable political party in future? Or are they going to declare themselves a sovereign country, autonomous region? We don't know that. I mean, these are the questions that really shapes our understanding of Myanmar, not only us, even in West or East, wherever you go.
Sure. Just very briefly to close the loop on the prior question on how to square the circle between some of the abuses the AA is accused of and the necessity of engaging them on repatriation. In addition to the durability of the AA, I think that the potential alternatives, I sort of laid out why I don't think that the Myanmar military is likely to come back. And in addition to that, if they were to come back, I think they would be at least as hostile to the return of the Rohingya, and they would be doing so while controlling a territory that is home to a population that's hostile to it. The other potential scenario is that of the Rohingya armed groups, and I do not foresee in the near to mid-term them posing a significant threat to the Arakan Army's territorial control in northern Rakhine, but rather posing a barrier to returns in the future, in that they are making the camps in Bangladesh less safe for the Rohingya who are here. They are undermining social cohesion in Rakhine. They're undermining the Bangladesh-Rakhine relationship, and they are feeding into some of the negative stereotypes that characterize Rohingya in Myanmar as a whole. And so those alternate scenarios, I think, are perhaps even more problematic than the current one, even though the current one is problematic. But jumping to your question on the AA and accountability and recognition, on the question of independence, I don't see the AA attempting to declare independence. I think they recognize that that is a problematic position for them to take, and there's it brings a lot of difficulties and doesn't necessarily bring significant benefits. So I think in the near to medium term, very low likelihood that that's a direction that they take. I think that they have stated pretty clearly that they seek a significant degree of autonomy, similar to what the Wa have been able to carve out in the northeast of Myanmar. And I think that seems to be the aim, although is complicated by the military's continued control over Sitwe, the state capital, and the host of the Indian-built port, and Chaopyu, where the Chinese oil and gas pipelines originate, and the site of a port project, and eventually a rail project from Chaopyu to Mandalay, and from there to Yunnan. So, I think that those factors influence some of the geopolitical dynamics. On the issue of IDPs, I think it's and those who have been displaced from Rakhine. I think it's important again to draw a distinction between the military and the AA here, in that since the coup, there are now in 2021 there are now 3.4 million internally displaced people in Myanmar. It is the Myanmar military that is responsible for the vast majority of Rohingya who are now refugees in Bangladesh, and the 150,000 or so Rohingya who have crossed into Bangladesh since late 2023. The vast majority of those crossed when there was active conflict in Rakhine, which is not to discount the small-scale ongoing displacement from Rakhine to Bangladesh that is happening among Rohingya, but just to draw that distinction. In terms of accountability, I think that there is a governance challenge that the AA has. I think because of what they've been able to achieve militarily for the ethnic Rakhine population, they have a fair amount of runway. I think the symbolic value of the capture of Mra'u, which was the capital of the Arakan kingdom, that should not be underestimated. I think that's a really important symbolic victory for them and for the Rakhine population, and gives them, I think, a little bit more leeway to govern as they see fit than might otherwise be the case. But Rakhine has been under a humanitarian blockade for several years now. With the conflict in the Gulf, gas prices are spiking across the country, but particularly in Rakhine State. In Sitwe, getting reports that fuel is up to $20 per liter for civilians, which is just an exorbitant amount of money. And there is a lot of real hardship in Rakhine State for not just the Rohingya population, although I would argue that they are suffering more acutely than others, but for Rakhine and Moro and Chin and other ethnic minorities as well. And it will be incumbent upon the AA to demonstrate that in the territory it controls, it can deliver on social services, healthcare, education, that it can provide access to justice, and that some of these rudimentary systems that are being set up and have been increasingly entrenched over the last 5-6 years, that they can deliver what the local population wants and needs. And if it does not, I think that there will start to be some pushback, not just from Rohingya communities and not just from non-Rakhine communities, but from Rakhine communities as well.
No, this is quite interesting, Steve. I mean, I was just thinking that when you were explaining the war model, war state model, and other models, that brings me to one very critical, I would say, introspection of Bangladesh's diplomacy. I mean, this is why, because if you have this war model coming, then you are actually talking about a very different kind of arrangement that is going to take place. I mean, war state has their own army, they have their own currency, they have very strong relationship with China, and of course, they work as some sort of buffer between China and Myanmar too. I mean, which is essentially a security guarantor at the end of the day too. And then in between, there are two things. I mean, two criticism of Bangladesh's diplomacy. One is that, Bangladesh lacks a genuine strategy. That's one sort of criticism that I used to hear during Awami League regime, and then subsequently that interim regime came. And when interim regime came, the narrative changed and said, this is more about managed optics in a sense. Even I remember some of my Rohingya friends would always argue that interim government's agenda was much more to push repatriation without creating enough ground of safety, security, dignity, and so on. So therefore, they had some sort of skepticism. But on the other hand, their engagement was fundamentally different than the Awami League regime, because this is where we got to see that interim government was quite active to have some sort of meaningful conversation with the Arakan Army. But again, the result is not there, but certainly that sort of approach was that resulted in, summoning of our ambassador, Bangladeshi ambassador to Naypyidaw. So you had that backlash too. So, that takes me to a very different kind of understanding about diplomacy, because you now have that whole design that you have talked about. Bangladesh needs to think about repatriation, but it has to be pragmatic too, as the Rohingyas would say. And many of your friend or my friend in Rakhine would also say that this is not the best time, because Arakan Army is also going through war fatigue. That essentially takes you to less of political priority, more of tactical day-to-day stuff. And you observed in your Stevenson interview that there has not been nearly enough urgency in many cases, and that's a problem. And looking at what Bangladesh has actually produced diplomatically over the past 10 years, almost 10 years, that takes us to understand, your opinion that whether we had a coherent strategy. You're a researcher. I'm asking your research point of view rather than Steamson's point of view, right?
Sure.
Your personal opinion. Is that a coherent strategy we had, despite, as I said, that, I don't see much difference between Awami League regime and interim, except for managed optics that where 180,000 people will be taken back. Dr. Yunus saying they will go and say their prayers and have iftar next year. This gives a lot of hope, but at the end of the day, nothing comes out. Or has it been the management of appearances in the absence of a workable framework?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to, as a starting point, acknowledge just how difficult this problem is and the scale of the challenge. So to expect a near-term resolution of any government of a challenge of this magnitude is probably setting expectations at an unrealistic level. Having said that, I think in the early days of the crisis, or this iteration of the crisis in 2017, there was a coherent strategy. It was just a problematic one. The strategy was to try and replicate the repatriation instruments of the 1990s and to pursue repatriation in the same mold as in the 1990s, when the influx at that time was 200 to 250,000 rather than 3 times that amount. And so I think both the scale of the problem, the challenge, and the different power structures of the Myanmar military, of China and China's support for Myanmar, all played a role in that approach at that time. Since then, I would say that there has certainly been an element of trying to address the problem through performative acts. That sort of, I think, play to more of a domestic audience and to address domestic Bangladeshi concerns about the long-standing nature of the crisis, and to placate some of the concerns domestically. But I think other efforts have been more substantive in nature, and I think with respect to the interim government, they deserve credit on 2 fronts in particular. One you alluded to, which is breaking the taboo of engaging directly with the AA. And I think that has set up the new government well to be able to engage without the same political costs that incurred to the interim government. The other is elevating the role of Rohingya civil society actors and giving Rohingya a seat at the table in a way that they had not been afforded seats at the table before. We could argue about whether they were the right actors, or if there's sufficient space for Rohingya civil society and political leadership in the camps. But that in and of itself was a shift from previous governments, and I think a step in the right direction. I think both of those elements, the role of Rohingya having a seat at the table and engaging the AA, are critical pieces to how this moves forward. But I would say it's been very difficult because of the size of the challenge to craft a coherent strategy. And you've had major shifts in the dynamics on the Myanmar side of the border over the last several years. You had a military coup in 2021. You had the outbreak of conflict in Rakhine in 2 different iterations from 2018 to 2020. There was a very significant conflict between the AA and the military at that time, which I think is often overlooked. And then conflict broke out again in late 2023 with the AA taking over the bulk of the state. So being able to adapt to these really major reverberations from the Myanmar side, I think has been a significant and understandable challenge for Bangladesh.
No, I mean, that challenge is also translated into what we call security dynamics at the border. I mean, if you look at, I mean, this is where I'm going to set the record very straight because you see, there is a huge narrative that is circulating in international community by saying that Bangladesh's security establishment has encouraged armed movement coming from the Rohingya community. And perhaps this is essentially against Arakan Army. But if that is the case, then why Bangladesh government is sitting with the Arakan Army? So, I mean, I'm not saying that government, but essentially I'm saying that Bangladeshi entities are encouraging greater communication with the Arakan Army. At the same time, there is a strong view, not only in Dhaka, but in many places, that this is essentially, this sort of narratives are essentially to deflect from Arakan Army's own activities that we tried to discuss earlier. Even if you look at all these ICG reports and many other reports, even Tom Keane has written about it, I mean, we are seeing that the whole narrative of Rohingya leadership is there, but essentially nobody is translating that what kind of leadership is needed. I mean, is it, I mean, a population of 1.1 or 1.5 million stateless, I mean, very difficult to get a coherent leadership, to be very honest with you, right? I mean, it's quite not always pragmatic. And you have rightly mentioned that we may disagree or we may debate about the people who are sitting on behalf of the Rohingyas. But at the end of the day, Rohingyas are actually now sitting. At the same time, the civilian political space for the Rohingyas in Rakhine is virtually non-existent. So here, I think your deep field knowledge of Bangladesh-Myanmar border, I mean, what does the evidence actually show that who benefits from the narratives of, maligning Bangladesh's security position, whereas Bangladesh's security position is very clear. I mean, they don't want to get into any kind of, conspiracy theories that we get to hear.
So yeah, maybe I'll start on the Rakhine side and draw some distinctions between central and northern Rakhine. I think that there have always been cultural differences between Rohingya and central and northern Rakhine. In central Rakhine, they generally made up about 20 to 40% of the population. This was pre-2017. And as a result, were not viewed as much of a threat as Rohingya were in northern Rakhine, where they made up 80 to 90% of the population. They were better integrated in central Rakhine and were seen as less religiously and socially conservative compared to Rohingya in northern Rakhine. And I think a key development over the last couple of years has been that of the Rohingya armed groups. That has not been a factor in central Rakhine. And as a result, I think you see comparatively better relations between Rakhine and Rohingya in central Rakhine. And there is somewhat more space afforded to Rohingya in central Rakhine compared to northern Rakhine. I do think that the armed groups are a significant factor in the north. I think, you could make an argument that there is a real threat perception there from the Arakan Army side. And over the last 6 to 12 months, and particularly during the conflict in 2024, when there were recruits going from the camps to fight against the military and against the AA and alongside the military, created this threat perception of Rohingya being able to move back and forth and of being antagonistic towards the AA, and that is a dynamic that I think has spiraled. I think you could also make the argument that the presence of the Rohingya armed groups is used as a pretext to avoid discussion of how Rohingya are treated differently than other groups, or worse than other groups. I would say that the border dynamics are quite complicated. We have seen an uptick in attacks by groups like ARSA over the past 6 or 12 months. I think that plays into the perception of Rohingya armed groups as a threat and complicates both the dynamics for Rohingya that are still in northern Rakhine and those that would like to return for some of the reasons that I laid out earlier in terms of how it impacts Rakhine-Rohingya relations, Rakhine-Bangladesh relations, and how Rohingya are perceived in Myanmar more broadly. And just zooming out a bit there, I think it's worth stating how in Myanmar more broadly, the AA is viewed as being at the vanguard of the resistance now. It is the largest armed group that is currently fighting the military. It controls more territory and a larger population than any other armed group in Myanmar. And to have Rohingya fighting back against that group that is at the forefront of fighting against the military hurts perceptions of Rohingya in Myanmar more broadly. So, I think that there is more that the AA needs to do to demonstrate that it will be inclusive of Rohingya in its governance, particularly in northern Rakhine, to ensure freedom of movement, to ensure access to social services and livelihoods, and as the de facto governing authority, it bears primary responsibility for delivering on those fundamental rights.
No, this is fascinating because you really highlighted a very important issue, which is the inclusivity. So inclusivity is extremely important because every conversation that we have regarding repatriation eventually arrives at a very uncomfortable question. And many times the diplomatic conversation would consistently avoid that, which is the issue of whether Rakhine Buddhist community and Rohingya Muslims actually coexist in the same territory after decades of state-engineered hatred that we have seen, communal violence we have seen, and now another round of displacement and atrocity that we have discussed, right? And you have seen that. I mean, you have seen how this particular relationship between the Buddhist Muslims between 2014 and 2017 morphed. And you have seen that misinformation, misperception was very much there. And you have highlighted the very important question about the perception, how the Rohingyas are being perceived, not only through the Arakan Army's prism or Buddhist prism, but through the military's prism too. And it's been like decades or perhaps multiple generations have been victim of this misperception. And that dehumanization we also get to see in many narratives. And I'm not saying that it is only the junta or others are doing, but we also sometimes pick up dehumanization narratives from Arakan Army's vocabulary too. And you have rightly mentioned that Arakan Army has to go extra mile for inclusion. And I'm one of the persons who would always argue that, trade and investment relationship between Bangladesh and Rakhine, although Rakhine is a part of Myanmar and Bangladesh is a sovereign country, but we can always find a mechanism to stabilize Rakhine, and in which I think the Buddhist population will have to come forward. I mean, if they don't come forward, then we don't get to see that there will be a lot of meaningful support coming from either from the Rohingyas or Bangladesh as such. And I was speaking to a friend from the Rohingya civil society, and he's one of the leaders who was saying there is no Arakan without Rakhine, without Rohingya, and no Arakan without Rakhine too. So which means they accept the fact that they have to live and coexist with each other. And he was repeatedly telling me that we need peaceful existence. Now, do you think that aspiration among the Rohingyas a realistic one? Or how are they going to build confidence? I mean, Arakan Army will build some sort of coexistence mechanism between the Rohingyas once they're repatriated, or perhaps with the Buddhists. And, what would genuine intercommunal reconciliation actually require? And is anyone doing that work? I mean, I'm quite sure you are, but also I'm trying to figure out if there are others.
Yeah. Before getting there, I want to put a pin in your highlighting the structural violence against the Rohingya as state engineered, because I think that's an important framing that in the current context is sometimes lost, which is that the othering of the Rohingya is something that occurred over decades and was led and perpetrated by the Myanmar military.
Right.
And so recognizing that and understanding that actor cannot be a reliable partner in Rohingya repatriation, I think is quite important. But to the question about peaceful coexistence, I certainly hope that it is realistic, and it's something where I am an eternal optimist. I think you have to be to work on challenges that are this difficult. It would essentially be a real loss to Myanmar and to the Rohingya community if this were not achievable, and the Myanmar military's desire to see the Rohingya completely removed from Rakhine were realized. But we are quite a long ways from peaceful coexistence becoming a reality in Myanmar, and there's a long way to go to get there. Some of the elements that I think are necessary are, as a starting point, an openness from both sides to be able to engage with one another and with good intentions. That there needs to be more space, both in Rakhine and in Bangladesh, for genuine and legitimate and representative Rohingya civil society actors to emerge. And there was a period of time in 2017 to 2019 where I think that space existed in Bangladesh, and it has closed somewhat since then, I think because of security dynamics in the camps, meaning that people are unable or unwilling to raise their voices in a way that they might want to, and where there have been, I think, restrictions placed on the activities of Rohingya groups. But in general, more space for legitimate Rohingya civil society actors to emerge, and a closing of space for Rohingya armed actors on both sides of the border. I think there needs to be a appropriate platform to address the power imbalances between the Arakan Army and the Rohingya community, and that we need to acknowledge that those power imbalances exist. I think a truth and reconciliation mechanism is probably needed, and a starting point could be the shared or separate experiences of how both Rakhine and Rohingya suffered under the military. That might be an appropriate starting point. And I think that there needs to be more space for actors that want to achieve peaceful coexistence. I think that's incumbent both on the AA, recognizing that it can't do it completely on its own, even though it's trying to some extent. You see the AA celebrating Iftar and Eid with Rohingya, and social cohesion football matches and things of that nature. But the same is true in Bangladesh, where I think the security dynamics in the camps are such that there right now is not a prominent counter narrative to that of the Rohingya armed groups, because there just is not the space and safety to be able to articulate that counter narrative. To summarize, I think more space for civil society actors and for activities that that would enable and promote peaceful coexistence between the communities. It's a mid to long term endeavor for sure.
No, I mean, this is very important to talk a little bit on the term that you have used is power imbalance. Then you have also talked about truth and reconciliation mechanisms. And I think these are two very, very critical factors if we are actually aiming towards some sort of coexistence between these two entities. And you're right that I rarely get to hear counter narratives within the Rohingya community. And I think Rohingya civil society will have to do more work on that, along with, of course, Arakan Army doing that. Because, you see, this brings me to another complicated issue. Yes, truth and reconciliation. Yes, we are talking about power imbalance. If you see it from a very economic point of view, yes, we are willing to give skills to the Rohingyas, and the government is in the process of giving the skills. But at the end of the day, there is also a massive concern in Bangladesh that, look, we already have more than 2 million people getting included in our job market, and unemployment rate is extremely high. And then even if you see it from a labor economic point of view, I mean, how are we going to give them employment, or what are they going to do with these skills, right? I mean, so that means we are willing to give these skills, but we don't know how to use these skills because you already have more people being added to the national economy. And then obviously we get to hear that the military or SSC said that they have cleared the verification of 180,000 Rohingyas. But what about the rest? So, I mean, and then they're talking about these 180,000 Rohingyas are cleared to return, but to the territory in which they don't have any control. So what it means that these sort of narratives are nice to hear, but essentially the practicality remains as a contested issue. Even the Amnesty has repeatedly said that even if repatriation takes place, the situation is not conducive for anybody to go back. Even if you look at the land law in Myanmar, I mean, once you vacated, whether the Rohingyas will get back, properties will be returned to them, we don't know. I mean, that kind of legal mechanism makes the repatriation even harder. So what repatriation actually looks like, if I ask you that, what does safe, voluntary, dignified repatriation actually look like in practice? Or what conditions, what guarantees, what timeline, and what actors have to do what for it become real rather than aspirational or, hypothetical and theoretical?
Yeah, that's the multi-billion-dollar question. I mean, I would start by saying that I think that the process of repatriation, when and if it is able to begin, is likely to start informally. That, if there are signals from Rakhine that Rohingya in small numbers are able to return, they have access to livelihoods, they have perhaps access to their original land, access to social services, they have a degree of freedom of movement. If some of those signals are sent, I think there is a decent number of Rohingya in the camps right now who would see that as a better option for themselves and their families than remaining in the camps in perpetuity. I think there continues to be a trust issue and a trust deficit between Rakhine and Rohingya, and that would need to be addressed as a part of any repatriation process, informal or otherwise. But I think that the starting point is likely to be informal in nature. And it starts with the signal for how the Rohingya that remain in Rakhine are treated, both in central and in northern Rakhine. And I think you highlighted one of a few issues that's going to be particularly challenging and contentious. One is returns to places of origin. In many cases, villages don't exist anymore.
True.
Some were bulldozed by the Myanmar military in the wake of the clearance operations in 2016 and 2017. Some villages have been reclaimed by jungle. Some villages have been, or dwellings have been inhabited by other ethnic groups. So that question of where people may return to, I think, is a critical one that is an unanswered question at this point. And the other question that is, I think, particularly sensitive is that of citizenship. That is not something that we've discussed yet today, but is at the heart of some of the matters surrounding the Rohingya. They were stripped of citizenship in the 1980s, and their rights were gradually reduced over time. And this is a core demand of many Rohingya, for some a prerequisite for returns. And I think there's a real question around how that issue is addressed when you have a non-state armed group like the Arakan Army in control of the territory of Rakhine, or most of the territory of Rakhine. And how you address that when you have a military or quasi-civilian government in Naypyidaw that has not really shown an inclination to grant Rohingya citizenship. The NUG has not made moves on this issue since it was formed in 2021 after the coup. So this, I think, is a real big unanswered question. I think that for the average Rohingya, what matters in practice is the realization of the rights that citizenship is meant to entail. And that's something that the Arakan Army, if it chose to do so, could grant to the Rohingya that are currently in Rakhine and to those that might return, even if it is short of granting formal citizenship.
I mean, I'm saving this citizenship conversation for another session with you in the coming months, because I think citizenship issue will take us to a huge discussion. I mean, very broad discussion, because that will bring in the structural issues, institutional issues. Then again, I get to hear often people are telling me that, well, they never had dignity in Rakhine. They never had basic rights in Rakhine. I mean, now why international community is imposing that there has to be dignity and so on. So that kind of conversation is very much there. I mean, I'm not saying that these are sane conversation, but these are the conversation that dwindles around the policy circles. I mean, now, given all these issues that you have highlighted, I mean, I'm intrigued to go back to your congressional testimony, and the testimony was labeled as no exit strategy. I mean, that was quite an eye-opener for me, that, well, testimony is labeled as no exit strategy, which to me is a diagnosis. I mean, that's not a prescription. Now, you being a practitioner of that, you being a good friend to different actors, I mean, the Rohingyas or the Arakan Army or Bangladesh or United States or the communities, and I go back to Azim Ibrahim or perhaps Ronan Lee, who has also a very, very deep understanding by saying that the solutions are not going to be very easy for anybody. Now, Bangladesh's diplomatic fatigue, as you can understand, so is the diplomatic fatigue for Thais and ASEAN, and obviously India is very much there. And then Washington pulling itself out from the whole engagement through humanitarian prism. And I'm not a great fan of humanitarian approach to this particular issue. Of course, I'm not denying that this is a fact, but I'm also trying to understand whether the transactionality can help through trade and investment in bringing some sort of stability in Rakhine too. Now, all these things, I mean, is there a realistic pathway, Steve, forward? I mean, not a theoretical one that you and I would discuss over coffee table, or perhaps if you and I are sitting in Rohingya camp or in Rakhine or perhaps in a situation room. I mean, what are the recommendations that you would give to international community, to the regional community, and most importantly, those who are working on Myanmar issue at this stage?
Well, we go back to the question that you raised earlier about who has the most power to influence this crisis, and the answer that I had there was the actors that are closest to the ground. So in this case, I think it's the Rohingya, the AA, and Bangladesh, and those are really the key stakeholders that have the ability to plot a path forward here. I think other stakeholders in the international community, potentially in Myanmar and elsewhere, can play a supporting role, but it's really the actors that are closest to the problem, the challenge, that need to devise the pathway forward. What I would suggest on the Bangladesh side is a movement towards recognition that the short-term goal of repatriation, which has been pursued now for the last 8.5 years with very little success, that should still be an objective to realize the repatriation of Rohingya refugees, but it needs to be better melded with medium-term solutions that are going to make that repatriation more attractive to the de facto authorities in Rakhine and more sustainable. And I would argue that there are a few key elements to that. You alluded to one of them earlier, the openness from the Bangladesh side for skills building, but the question being, where that leads, given Bangladesh's own growing population in the labor force. I think there probably has not been enough work done to try to match where the economic gaps are in Rakhine to skills that Rohingya could bring to the table. That's one area where I think there could be some work done. I think looking at the informal economies that already exist in Cox's Bazar, and perhaps starting with the informal economies that exist within the camps themselves, and looking at ways to regularize those. Education, I think, is critical, and that's an area that has been hit hard by funding cuts, but where there needs to be investment, and maybe there are some technological tools that help to enable that further, whether it's remote learning or innovations in AI. But that's an area where I think there needs to be some development. We discussed the issue of civil society space. I think that's another key piece. One of my pet issues, I would say, is how the issue of localization is conceived in the Bangladesh context. In Bangladesh, it is, in my experience, viewed as something that is only focused on localization from international NGOs to Bangladeshi NGOs, and that there should be scope for Rohingya to be included and encapsulated in how localization is conceptualized here, both in terms of putting Rohingya in more leadership positions that would serve them well here, and also upon return to Rakhine, and building skills that enable returns to be more sustainable. And then finally, I think is the critical issue of security. That continues to be the number one issue that Rohingya raise when discussing concerns within the camps. It's been persistent for a number of years now. It is a very difficult challenge for Bangladesh to manage a population of more than 1 million people, and to control the security dynamics within the population. But I think if we are to see improvements in the dynamics on the Bangladesh side of the border as an enabler for repatriation in the future, security is at the foundation for all of those other things that I mentioned.
No, Steve, I mean, this is fascinating. Your forensic conclusion. I mean, literally brought everything to the table that needs to be discussed with openness, candidness, and most importantly, with enough information, data, and everything. Because when you talk about education, yes, and I think one thing Arakan Army is trying to do is to get more teachers to be recruited for delivering education in Rakhine. And then farming is a very important issue, because I think one of the reason, for the food crises or food insecurity is stemming from obviously the lack of farming capacities at the moment. And you have mentioned a very difficult information to digest, that a liter of petrol is now $20. I mean, look at how the economy is really getting to a very catastrophic situation, if that is the case. So that means I think we need to really talk largely about that. How do we help in creating stability or economic stability in Rakhine? And I, for one, who believes that economy is the key for everyone, even if you want to reduce the dependency on narcotics, if you want to reduce insecurity, you need to give people work. I mean, this is where I think skills building in terms of social entrepreneurship or small and medium entrepreneurship or technology, everything will be helpful for the Rakhine population at the end of the day. And I'm quite sure that civil society to civil society communication in the coming years, as we see that Rakhine evolves, will be very essential. If we want to go back to your ideas of truth and reconciliation mechanisms, or the social cohesion building, or confidence building mechanisms. So with that note, Steve, thank you very much for your time, and I think my audience will be quite benefited from your insights, your understanding, and I would say wisdom that you have accumulated through years of experience in living in Myanmar, working with the Burmese international community, and most importantly with Bangladesh. So that's what I think is very invaluable for the international audience as well as my audience, whether in Bangladesh and beyond. Thank you very much, Steve, for your time.
Thank you for having me, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we had a very elaborative discussion with Mr. Steve Ross, and Steve has highlighted the gaps in foreign policy, the weaknesses in international efforts, and most importantly, that he has been quite vocal about recommendations which will prevent the crises from becoming a permanent catastrophe. And I think what is very important here is to realize that this particular crisis cannot be seen from a binary prism, that it is only Bangladesh's responsibility, or perhaps international community alone can solve it, or perhaps the regional actors are the key elements. But what Steve really highlighted, that this has to be a combination of different actors, different institutions, different approaches, and Bangladesh must have a what we call coherent framework to deal with it. I mean, if somebody wants to see it from an economic point of view, somebody wants to see it from security point of view, that sort of compartmentalization and silos really don't help. So what we need is a coherent understanding, coherent framework, which should include all the puzzles that creates this catastrophe in making. Thank you very much for your time and patient hearing.